Hey everybody, thanks for joining me today. I'm going to be talking about creating bottom-up and top-down academic listening materials. This is a session that I gave at TESOL 2019 in Atlanta, and I just wanted to make it more widely available to the TESOL community because I had such positive feedback from the people that came to my session, and so that's what I'm doing today. All right, where are we going today? So, as I said, my name is Sharon Chaden-Glass, and I am a partnerships coordinator and instructor for the intensive English program at the University of Dayton in Dayton, Ohio. I also am a co-editor for Intercom, which is the newsletter for TESOL's Intercultural Communication interest section. Now, the materials that I'm going to be sharing with you today, you can get at that Google Drive link, or you can grab that Q code and it'll take you directly there. And that includes the videos that you'll see. So I'm primarily talking today to intensive English programs and, sorry, that's not how I want to do it. There we go. Intensive English programs and English for academic purposes and higher education. But as you'll see, a lot of the activities, especially the games and in-class activities and things for self-study, can be used at home. So I hope that everybody takes something away from this session. All right, so I have three main components for what I'm talking about today. First, I'll look at how we teach second language listening. What are we missing? I'll be talking then about bottom-up listening, specifically some activities and games that you can use in your classroom. And then top-down listening, how you can make videos and assessments in your class. All right, so first, how are we teaching second language listening when we're teaching it? So maybe you've had this kind of experience when you're teaching and what you say to your students is listen and take notes, okay? Then you say answer questions. Then after that you say, did you get the right answers? No? What did you get? Why? And then finally, when our students inevitably ask how they can improve their listening, what we end up saying is, just listen more. So this approach is called the Comprehension listening approach. And it's just like I described, listen, take notes, and answer questions. There are definite benefits to using this approach, the first one being that it gives our students exposure to language and experience making sense of language. And that does have its place and it is important. But more importantly for us as teachers, this enables us to create a curriculum around listening. It enables students to pass and also fail exams so we can have measurable outcomes, so we can move students through levels of a program. The book that I have up here in the corner, right here, this is Field's Listening in the Language Curriculum book. And I will tell you, it is really truly a remarkable book. If there's no other book that you have on your bookshelf about how to teach listening, just buy this book. It's all that you really need because he combines theory and some very practical answers about how to actually put this into your classroom. All right, so I'm going to keep referring to Field as I go through this. So Field points out that there are drawbacks to the approach as well as benefits. The comprehension listening approach has a view that difficulties in recognizing sounds and words in the input are of a lower order of importance and that many of them can be resolved by the use of context. So what he's saying here is that when our students have trouble understanding, what we often do is we say, well, just use context to figure it out, and that's often not enough for them. So this approach is very good at teaching listening. It's good at testing listening, but it's not really good at teaching students how to listen. And so now I'm going to talk about his research that helped him reach this conclusion. And what Field finds in his research is that only 25% of intermediate listeners, and that is a CEFR level of B1, were able to identify known words in a string of speech during a paused transcription activity. So what a paused transcription activity is, what he's talking about is they would play an audio recording for students, they would pause it, and then ask the student to recall accurately the previous 5 words that they heard. Okay, and so let me show you now how accurately students were able to recall. As you recall from the slide I just said, it was only 25%. Well, let's look at exactly what that means. So here's a chart from his book, and what we're looking at here is these are the 5 words that students heard right before the audio was paused. And they had to recall each of these words. And so what we're seeing is that in his level 5 in their program, which is CEFR B1, students were most likely able to accurately recall a word each, about maybe 25% of the time, or 30%. And these other words were even lower than that. It's not till level 6 and 8 and level 9, which is B2 and above, that students start able to accurately recall words. Here's another example. This one is actually 6 words. 2 of them are very small function words. Expect a higher standard of entertainment. So obviously entertainment is the word that is most likely being recalled, and that's probably because that's a content word, right? And it's the last word that they heard. But still, they're only able to recall that with maybe 50% accuracy, and then these other words are even lower. And so what Field deduces from his research is that it's plain that second language learners succeeded in decoding far less of the input than their teachers tended to assume. It's not a question of their linguistic knowledge. The language of the text was well within their range. They know these words, right? But it appears that the ability to recognize known vocabulary and syntax may fall well behind the ability to produce it. So it's a pretty sobering thought when we think about our expectations of what our students who are B1 learners understand. We're probably overestimating how much they accurately understand from spoken English. So his important point, one important point that he makes in his book is that we need to consider how our brains actually process listening. So our memory relies on 2 parallel systems for making sense of what we perceive. We have long-term memory here, and we also have long-term memory, which includes our past experiences, and contextual knowledge. So there's our context. But then we also have our short-term working memory, which processes linguistic and other perceptual input on the fly. So too often when our learners struggle with listening, it's because they are investing so much effort into working memory here. So when they're investing so much effort into just decoding words, it puts a lot of strain on our working memory, and so it decreases our capacity for applying listening processes that rely on our long-term memory. So on this side, it gets smaller, our ability to be able to do those things. So Field argues that too often we as teachers resort to the problems of our students struggling with their working memory by simply telling them to shift their attention to these long-term memory processes like relying on context. But this doesn't always work, and Field argues that instead we should devote time in our classroom to strengthening our students' working memory. So making this strong, putting time into helping them increase their ability to hold information in working memory. And over time, this can help them free more mental capacity to make their long-term memory more accessible. So what Field says is that we should be helping them practice decoding with the purpose of helping them develop automatic processing that characterizes skilled listening. So if you think about that, what he's saying is that we should help our students develop that automaticity in being able to decode so they're able to access their long-term memory. At the same time, he tells us that we can't neglect top-down listening, because when we're building meaning, our goal is to encourage the learner to transfer processes already well established in their first language, but not yet employed in the unfamiliar circumstances of listening to a foreign language. So, of course, we see that good listeners are able to do both top-down and bottom-up listening processes. Now, in Field's book, he identifies 4 types of approaches to listening, and he does a very good job of explaining that it's not just one approach that you need in your classroom. In order to have a balanced approach for your students, you need to be doing a little bit of each approach. So, as you probably know if you've been teaching ESL for a while, most books focus here on the comprehension approach, where we assess comprehension through questions that are level appropriate. But Field argues that we also need to take on a diagnostic approach and an extensive listening approach. We have to get our students listening outside of classroom, right? So this is at home. And we also need to analyze our comprehension breakdowns in our students and note common errors among our learners so we can address them as a class. And then also we have this process approach where we're repeating listening to a prompt, where we play it more than one time, where we are applying compensatory listening strategies, and where we're working on decoding, parsing, and ear training. In this particular presentation, I'm going to be focusing on these 2 areas. First, I'll look at decoding for bottom up, and then I'll look at assessing listening comprehension. All right, so the first is bottom up. We're going to look at some activities for strengthening students' bottom up listening skills. Lyrics Training, if you've never heard of it, is an interactive app and a website. And the idea here is that it helps you create listening cloze games based on movie scenes, TV shows, and songs. So this helps students practice recognizing those known words in English, building that sound-word correspondence. You can do these together as a class, or you can just make it a self-study tool for students to use. And because songs can be repetitive, it employs some of the top-down listening because students start to expect, oh, the verse is going to repeat again, and then they can use those processes as well. You're not able yet to assign exercises in this app and website, and you're not able yet to check student progress, but I think if it becomes popular, you should be able to do that in the future. So let me show you now what that looks like. All right, the next one is using Kahoot with paused videos. So I'm assuming a lot of you have used Kahoot before. And so I think that you will like using this as well. So the idea in this activity is you find a video that has parts of it that you want to test students' ability to understand the words. So you add a segment of a YouTube video to a Kahoot question, and you can ask for common words or phrases that you want them to be able to recognize, maybe exact words that they heard, or you can create questions that test their ability to parse apart spoken utterances. So let me show you now what that looks like. All right, and moving on, the next one is Youglish. And with Youglish, you're able to enter words and phrases into this search engine, and then it will find a bunch of YouTube videos in which that word or phrase is actually used. So students can hear that word or phrase in authentic connected speech. So it helps students build familiarity between the spoken and the written word. It's great for self-study and great for outside of class. There's nothing yet to assign students to be able to do as a class who can't really check student progress. But it also has an option of students being able to slow down or speed up the video. So let's take a look at that now. Okay, so another option, if you want a lower tech option, you can do a simple close listening passage. Once you've identified an area to work on with your class, you can create a close activity that focuses on specific problems in listening perception. And you want to make it limited to just one problem. So for example, I looked for a clip that I thought would be enjoyable to my students. So I found this Mars candy bar maker starts a new chapter in its history. It's about a new candy factory in Topeka, Kansas. And so it's all about Snickers and peanut butter M&Ms. So it's really interesting from that perspective. And when I created that close, it looked like this. So over here on the side, this is the point, oh, sorry. This is the point in the video when these examples come up, so 20 seconds, 40 seconds. And then students would fill in this blank. So here I had a year, here I had square feet, and then we have amount, number, a time, ratios. So this close was very helpful in focusing on numbers. Okay, moving on, we're going to move on to top-down listening now. How can you make videos and assessments? Since if you're a listening teacher and you have a curriculum and need to give tests, how can you create videos and assessments that do that? So our challenge in our program is to create videos that are appropriate for B1 learners, specifically B1 moving into B2. So B1 into B2 is a huge range. They're moving from familiar matters, things of personal interest, things about expectations, hopes, and dreams, into more abstract topics, and a larger range that maybe they don't know anything about, okay? There's a really interesting report that I read by Pearson Publishing, where they pulled together a lot of their big data to find out an approximate range for how long it takes students to move from B1 to B2. I encourage you to go take a look at that report. It's in my reference list. But depending on how fast or slow a learner is, it can take 380 to 1,100 instructional hours for students to move just from B1 to B2. It's a huge range. It takes a lot of effort. This is just another way of looking at it. It's a self-assessment grid. The previous one, if you want to see to compare, that was their global scale. And this is for students to understand where they are in their ability to use English. So again, you see things that they're familiar with, and you see complex lines of argument provided the topic is reasonably familiar. So it can't be something completely new that they can't find any foot in. So our approach in our program is to record videos of lectures. So we try to write and record in-house academic lectures as much as possible. And we create them in sets of 2. The first video, our intention is to play it for students 2 to 3 times and allow them to discuss with each other. And the second video, we play 1 to 2 times with no discussion, depending on what our purpose is. And the reason that we take this approach is we want to be able to use both a process approach and a comprehension approach. So for the lecture that students have the opportunity to talk with each other and share notes, you'll see later that we make different kinds of questions than we do for the lecture that they don't have time to talk and share notes. But it's important to us that we're able to assess both of those, so that's why we have these 2 different lectures, different sets. When we choose the topics of our videos, we are looking to see what textbook we're using, what our students' majors are, and what could be of particularly high interest. So we're looking for that sweet spot among those 3 areas. So here are some examples of lectures that we've done in the past. And you can see just how these lectures relate to each other. This would be part 1 and this would be part 2. With the exception of down here, these are multi-series parts. We got really creative and made some multi-part series. Here's some more that we've done. Ones that students really enjoyed. They really liked the smartphone addiction and effects of smartphones. And it's another one they also really thought tattoos was interesting. They thought that was an interesting one. So why did we choose lectures? Well, it's a familiar concept for students, but more importantly, it's structured and somewhat predictable. So for our students who are moving from B1 into B2, it's really helpful to give them some kind of structure so they're able to take off the load on their brain processing so they can do a little more decoding. It's approaching authenticity. It's not truly authentic, but it's not robotic either. And whether or not we like to admit it, I mean, direct instruction is still a pretty important form of instruction at the university level. Other reasons you might want to create your own: problems with publisher materials. It's really hard to find publisher-created lectures that are over 6 minutes long. What we aim for, we try to create lectures that are 8 to 12 minutes long. These are some books that we've used in the past. There's benefits and disadvantages to all of them. There's no perfect textbook so far, but none of these have offered us lectures that are over 6 minutes long that the students don't already have access to. It's also difficult to find lectures that are level appropriate and contain desired vocabulary and content. TED Talks are great, but ... you can fill that in with a number of reasons. We've had difficulty with pacing in TED Talks. Sometimes the number, just the sheer amount of new vocabulary for students is just too much for students to handle. So TED Talks are nice, but we don't always feel comfortable using them as a form of assessment for our learners. Another huge problem, like I mentioned, is that students have access and can obtain assessments or transcripts. Well, if they have the transcript, that's great for that's great for a process approach, right? We want them to be able to do repeated listenings, but it's really not great for a class where you have to give a grade. Another reason to create your own, you know your context better than anyone else, and you know you have loads of free time, right? I'm just kidding. I don't. Yeah, anyone who's been an ESL teacher knows that you don't have loads of free time. Total joke. All right, another reason, because it decreases academic dishonesty as students can't access material ahead of time. You can tailor your SLOs. You can tailor your content to students' level and interests. And you can create your own in-house bank of listening assessments. So we've been doing this since 2015. We've managed to create 26 two-part and 3 multi-part series of lectures for a total of about 70 videos. And that's really helpful when you teach in an intensive English program that's on short terms like we are at 8 weeks. We're constantly having to create content and assessments. And so since we have this huge in-house bank of videos now, we can go a year and a half, 2 years without using one of the assessment videos that we've used before. And so it decreases academic dishonesty in that regard. All right. So if you're going to do this, what are the steps for recording your lecture? Well, you'll notice that it looks a whole lot like writing a paper. You're going to choose a topic that connects to your textbook topics, find your sources, write your script. As you're writing your script, be sure that you are using specific lecture language that you want students to do, especially if you're doing a presentation in your classroom. You want to model the kind of language that they should be using. So language for introducing a topic, making transitions, giving examples, clarifying, and especially language for attribution, which I'll talk about in a moment. You want to use target vocabulary. According to Webb and Nation, who wrote a book called How Vocabulary is Learned, you really should aim for 8 to 12 repetitions of a word in a transcript. So, I mean, that's a lot. So think about and use strategic thinking and how the number of vocabulary you want them to learn and how you're peppering it throughout your script. Next, you need to create visuals. That can include pictures, graphs, charts, animation. And in your script, you want to add notations about when you have animations and transitions. So what I usually do is I put like a number sign or hashtag right before the words that, so if I have words here and I have words here, I'll add two hashtags to tell me, oh, you have a transition, push the button so it goes to the next slide or the next animation. You want to practice, but you definitely don't need to be perfect because you want your students to have some authenticity or have some authentic listening. So if you have a false start or hesitation or you say something wrong, you want students to be able to backtrack and cope with that error. And then you record, edit, and produce, which I will talk about in a moment. So publications that I've used for inspiration when writing my lectures, I love National Geographic. I think it is absolutely full of well-researched articles, great visuals. So definitely I love National Geographic. Vox.com is awesome because its articles are informative, but they also provide links to original sources. Also check out Mother Jones. They have very strong investigative reporting on very interesting topics. And I have also found that to be true of The Atlantic. Another option that I've done is that I found a research study that addresses a key question about my topic, and then I report the findings. So as I mentioned before, it's really important to model how you give attribution to sources. So if you have an oral communication class where students are giving a presentation, this is a perfect opportunity to reinforce how that is done. too often students think that, oh, citation is just something that I do when I write, but we really want to drive home the point that no, if it's not your idea, you need to cite your source even when you're speaking. And then after they listen to the lecture, draw connections between what they heard in your lecture that you created and their actual presentation practice. So here are some examples of organizational patterns that I've used. So remember, like, I'm working with B1 learners. So I want to use organizational patterns that are pretty easy to understand so that they can focus more of their attention on the words that they're actually hearing. So I tend to go for a problem solution, chronology, cause effect, or maybe even just listing. So here's an example of a cause-effect lecture. So the hardest part for me is always getting an outline down. If I have the outline down, then I feel like, yeah, this isn't so bad. So in this particular lecture, I broke it down into, okay, I'm going to talk about physical, mental, and emotional effects. And then in each of those, I'm going to have some information that I've gathered from my research, right? And I have graphs. This article has some graphs that I can cite and use in my presentation. I also found a study from the University of Texas. I heard about this study on a podcast. It was super, super interesting. And then I decided, okay, well, I'll start with this book that was mentioned in this podcast and just some overview of statistics to make students interested. Another example of an outline I've done, this was for Controversies in Prosthetics. So this was a little bit different and more involved. I had basically athletics and the deaf community. So two very different controversies. And this one having to do with, are there advantages for people who have artificial limbs? And this one focused on how cochlear implants can rob a deaf person of their deaf identity, depending on how you see it. All right, so now I'm going to get into some methods of recording. So if you want to create your own lectures, how do you do that? So the easiest way to get started doing this is just to narrate PowerPoint slides. And just like I've been doing, use a pen and tablet, or you can even use your mouse and write on those slides as you talk. So now I'm going to share a video of how you can do that. All right, and another way that you can record yourself is simply by printing out your slides if you want to go completely low tech and just print out your slides and hold them next to your face. We have actually done that. I am not above that at all. So here's an example of his identity has been protected, but he decided just to print off his slides and talk to his camera. I've also done it where I recorded myself in front of my living room wall, and then I added a picture-in-picture through a video editing software. So this corner picture up here, this is actually a PowerPoint slide that I inserted into my video editing software. If you have the ability to record in a studio at your institution, I highly recommend that. Find out who does that. We do it with our Department of E-Learning. So we've done it with a studio and a whiteboard like this. We've also done it in the same studio on a monitor. So if we had more complicated visuals. We've also done it in full projection in a classroom, actually projected onto a screen. I had a very large map I wanted to use for this one. We also have a really cool technology called a light board. So as you can see, it looks like I'm standing behind the visual and pointing to it. So let me show you how that is accomplished. So this is the Lightboard Studio, and here you would be right here. And what you have is a piece of glass in front of you like this, and then you write on this glass, and then the camera over here flips the image so that it is, it reads the correct way. It flips it. And the result, and over here is what you look at. You can see yourself in this monitor screen over here and make sure that everything looks right. It's super cool. Our university has a studio like this, and I absolutely love using it. So if it's something that looks interesting to you, go just Google Lightboard and find out a little more about it. Maybe it's something your institution would be willing to support. All right, in terms of creating questions, when we look at Bloom's taxonomy, and we know that the bottom level of understanding is remembering, bottom level of Bloom's taxonomy is remembering and understanding. And so what we've done is we focus questions that are from part 2 on these 2 levels. And remember, this isn't the one, this is the one where students do not get a chance to talk to each other. So they don't have much time to consolidate their knowledge and make sense of it. So we feel better asking questions that have them analyze, evaluate, and apply these upper levels about lectures that they heard that they were able to discuss with each other. All right, so now I'm going to show you a couple examples of questions that represent these different levels in case you need a refresher or you don't know. So a remembering understanding question would be like, what is a copyright and what does a person need to do in order to have a copyright? So this one was about downloading music from the internet. And so this is a very basic, what's the answer to this question? Here's one that's a little bit different. So in this one we have, it's understanding and applying. So imagine you see this tattoo on a woman's foot. According to the lecture, what does this kind of tattoo mean, and what is a possible reason that the woman got this tattoo? So it's asking you to do both understanding and also applying. So this one was from a video that they heard and were able to discuss with their classmates. So here's one that's analyze and evaluate. This is one that they talked about with their classmates. So the lecture discussed 3 main reasons why people refuse to donate organs. Imagine that you work for an organization that's trying to increase the rate of organ donation in your native country. Which of the 3 reasons for refusing organ donation is the most difficult to overcome? Explain your point of view. So you can imagine that is a very difficult question to unpack if you just heard a lecture like 2 minutes ago. So this is the kind of question that you want to give students after they've had time to process, especially if they're an intermediate learner and they're still struggling with decoding. Okay. Whoops. A little too far. Sorry about that. Let's go back. All right, so that brings us to the very end. So here are my references, and I really thank you for joining me for this short presentation about how to create bottom-up and top-down academic listening materials. My contact information was at the beginning of the presentation, so just go all the way back to the beginning if you want to send me an email, let me know what you think. Thanks for joining me, and I hope I see you again.